To celebrate the release of the new Death Guard Codex, today on Datasheet Deep Dive, we're going to be talking about Nurgle's biggest, baddest, buggy boy himself, Mortarion, and asking ourselves the question, can anything in 40k kill this guy? Is it possible? Is he killable? What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the brand shiny new datasheet for Mortarion out of the brand also shiny, but maybe kind of a little slimy and gross Death Guard Codex that's just releasing this week. Before we get into the video, editing Trevi here to apologize for the audio in this one. Unfortunately, my microphone has a little bit of a rattle. I don't know what it is, and I couldn't manage to fix it. I ended up playing around with the audio to get rid of it because it was kind of annoying, and it makes me sound like I'm underwater the whole time. So if it sounds like I'm talking to you through my COVID mask, that would be why. But with that out of the way, let's get into this datasheet deep dive. As always in Datasheet Deep Dive, we're going to be talking about this datasheet for Mortarion, going over the attributes of the unit. In some ways, you can use it on the battlefield, as well as a lot of synergies that you can use alongside it, both inside the Death Guard Codex and with specific plague companies, but also with other Heretic Astartes detachments and Chaos Demons as well. Now, we're going to do something a little bit different for this datasheet deep dive, and instead of talk about the damage output of this unit and how much efficient damage you can crank out of it, we're going to talk about how hard it is to kill Mortarion and math some of the most commonly seen dangerous units in the game against his defensive profile, and ask ourselves the question, is it possible to kill Mortarion ever? Is he ever going to die? Last but not least, we'll go to a final verdict and ask ourselves, also, should you include Mortarion in your list? This is a little bit of a different style of datasheet deep dive, so if you do enjoy this style, go ahead and give the video a like. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It does really help me tell what kind of video, what style of video people enjoy seeing. So I do really appreciate it, and I'll love you forever. As a quick reminder as well, just a little under a week from the release of this video, we are going to be starting coverage of the T5S2 Season 2 Invitational. Some of the greatest players of Warhammer 40k in the world fighting it out online for fun and prizes, and we're going to be giving away prizes to people watching as well. So that's going to be awesome. You can tune into that here at youtube.com/tacticaltortoise and also at twitch.tv/tacticaltortoisetv. We'll be multi-streaming to both those places. And it's going to be super cool, so I'll see you there. All right, so with that housekeeping out of the way, and talk about what makes the Demon Primarch Mortarion so sick. Get it? It's sick because he's a Nurgle guy, you know? And they're the sick faction. It's funny. So Mortarion has been a staple of Warhammer 40k tables for ages. Back in the day, he was brought with Magnus all the time for the Super Smash Brothers list, where you brought both of them together and they just hit you with big sticks. And he's been a centerpiece for lots of different Death Guard builds forever. And in this datasheet, he got an enormous glow up. Coming in at 490 points, Mortarion is a Lord of War selection for a Death Guard detachment, and has an incredibly impressive stat block, starting at a 12-inch movement, 2+ weapon skill, and ballistic skill, as befits a Demon Primarch of the highest order. A strength and toughness value of 8, a big improvement from his previous datasheet where he was only toughness 7 and felt a little bit squishy. That was kind of a weird toughness value for Mortarion to be. Although, I mean, 7 is Nurgle's favorite number, right? So maybe it was a meme. He comes in at 18 wounds, which is an important breakpoint since it does mean that you can see him through obscuring terrain and he doesn't benefit from dense cover. Not that I think he needs it, but you know. He also, at his top bracket, has 7 attacks with a leadership 10, a 3+ armor save, and a 4+ invulnerable save thanks to his barbarian plate. Having so many wounds, he does degrade, but not very much. Each bracket after the first, he loses 2 inches of movement and 1 attack. And it's important to note as well that none of these new Death Guard datasheets in the Codex have the Hateful Assault special ability, so they do not get +1 attack when they charge. So he is locked in at 7 attacks unless you're going to buff it somehow. To make use of those attacks, he has a whole boatload of interesting attack profiles to choose from. He has 2 separate ranged weapons, his special plasma pistol, the Lantern, which comes in at essentially an overcharged plasma cannon profile for strength 8, -3 AP for 3 flat damage. Fortunately, it also doesn't kill him. That would be real awkward. But it does have a special role where he shoots it in a big line between him and whatever he hits, and makes a wound roll against everything he passes over. Pretty interesting, but at only a 12-inch range, not super duper useful. Every once in a while, you'll probably be able to line up a pretty cool strike with that thing, but not super often. Alternatively, he can also just throw his Fox Fex bomb grenades, at a 6-inch range for 2d6 shots, strength 5, AP 1 for 1 damage. And the blast keyword, good if he's trying to kill hordes. One of the strengths of Mortarion, traditionally, and this datasheet certainly continues that trend, is his ability to answer a wide variety of target profiles with his attacks. So either he can shoot the lantern for a flat 3 damage gun if he wants to, or he can blow up a bunch of little guys, and he does the same thing in melee as well. He's going to make d6 attacks with basically a Nurgling stat line. Strength 2, no AP for 1 damage, but the plague weapon keyword. But the showstopper for Mortarion is his big scythe Silence, although I think that's a bit of a miss of a name. I definitely would have spelled silence like SCY, because it's a scythe. Hey! Silence has 2 attack profiles that he can use whenever he fights. Either a big 2-handed eviscerating blow, which comes in at basically a Redemptor Fist profile for 2x strength, minus 4 AP for D3 plus 3 damage. That's going to make him strength 16, so he's going to wound almost the entire game on 2s, which is good because it also has the plague weapon keyword, meaning that he's going to be rerolling his 1s to wound innately. Alternatively, he can make a one-handed reaping scythe attack, which triples the number of attacks he makes, meaning he can attack 21 times if he really feels like it, for strength 8, neg 2 AP, and 1 damage. Where Mortarion really goes off is his special abilities. As is to be expected, he has the Disgustingly Resilient and Contagions of Nurgle abilities, which means that he innately, as long as you have an entire Death Guard army, projects a -1 toughness aura and reduces incoming damage by 1 to a minimum of 1. He also has a Chapter Master style ability in his Primarch of the Death Guard, which picks a core or character unit within 6 inches and gives them full rerolls to hit for the rest of the round. He can use that on himself, so although he doesn't innately reroll his own ones to hit anymore, he is going to be able to pick himself if he really wants to go into a whole boatload of enemy infantry or whatever and 100% convert his attacks, because he'd at that point be rerolling ones to hit and rerolling ones to wound thanks to Plague Weapon. He also innately gives core stuff within 6 inches, reroll hit rolls of 1. He must be your army's warlord unless you have another Demon Primarch in your armies. He explodes, which is hilarious, on a 4. Everything that doesn't have the Nurgle keyword within 6 inches takes D3 mortals. And he has a lot of different abilities to make use of those contagion rules. Thanks to his Host of Plagues ability, he gets to pick a warlord trait that your army does not already have from any of the Plague Host specific warlord traits. So that's going to give him the ability to adapt the contagion aura that he projects to whatever you need in that particular game. Later on in the video, I'm going to talk about what I think the best picks are for this particular ability, but it is cool that it's going to be sort of a pregame selection. Those contagion abilities are then compounded by the Toxic Presence ability, which always counts him as being battle round 4 for the purposes of contagion abilities, which means it is permanently a 9-inch aura off Mortarion. Now, in addition to that, some abilities that are not on his data sheet. If Mortarion is your warlord, unlike other special characters that have one locked-in warlord trait that they get, Mortarion gets 3 of them. Those are Revoltingly Resilient, which gives him the old version of Disgustingly Resilient, so a 5+ damage ignore roll. Living Plague, which turns off enemy aura abilities within 3 inches of him. That is a huge deal and really good for an aggressive character like Mortarion. And last but certainly not least, everyone's favorite gross, disgusting warlord trait, Arch Contaminator, which gives you full rerolls to wound for your core unit's plague weapons within 6 inches of Mortarion. Unfortunately, that means that the Arch Contaminator aura doesn't affect himself, but it will mean that all of your little plague knives are going to get full rerolls as long as he's near them. In addition, if they attack enemies within 12 inches, you do have that sweet 1 CP stratagem to turn your bolt guns into plague weapons also and get full rerolls for that. Arch Contaminator is a phenomenal ability, and I think for the most part, you're going to be probably including it in almost every Death Guard list you make anyway, so it's nice that Mortarion gets it for free. This means that Mortarion's data sheet is very much greater than the sum of its parts. He's got a lot going on, and you're probably going to have to make yourself some flashcards to remember all of the auras that he's currently projecting at any one time during the game. On top of that, Mortarion is a Psyker. He gets 2 casts and 3 denies, which is sort of a trait of the Nurgle subfaction. They are very good at denying psychic powers, at least a volume of psychic powers. And he knows 3 powers from the Contagion discipline in addition to Smite, so he has a very good selection of utility powers as well. On top of that, he has an awesome set of keywords. Not only is he Nurgle and Death Guard associated, but he also has the Heretic Astartes keyword, or he retains the Heretic Astartes keyword, which means that he can be affected by a lot of stuff out of the Chaos Space Marine Codex. He's also a monster, he flies, he's a Psyker, Importantly, he has the Supreme Commander keyword so that he can be brought in a Supreme Command detachment for free. And importantly, he is a demon, so that does make him a Chaos Demon because he has the 2 appropriate keywords. So that means when you're bringing Mortarion in your army, you're probably going to be bringing him in a Supreme Command detachment, which requires him to be the Warlord, but then gives him all those additional Warlord traits and brings him in for free without having to spend any additional seats. Now, one thing I want to mention is that in my previous Death Guard spoiler review videos, I did mention that there was a rule that was going around specifying that Mortarion could not be brought alongside any other Psychers in your army. When I made those videos, I was working off a spoiler document because we didn't have the entire Codex yet. And unfortunately, it looks like that particular rule doesn't actually exist in the Codex at all. So Magnus plus Mortarion, certainly something you can do. And he doesn't take all of the Malignant Plaguecasters out of your army immediately and like chuck them out an airlock. So overall, what are we looking at with Mortarion's datasheet here? He's basically got everything going for him. He's relatively fast at a movement of 12 inches. He's super duper hard to kill. Toughness 8 with -1 damage and a 5+ damage ignore probably most of the time is awesome. And he hits like an absolute Mack truck. Basically 1.5 Redemptor Dreadnoughts punching you. He doesn't shoot very good, but that's okay because he casts a billion psychic powers. And he acts as an enormous force multiplier, not just because of his reroll auras and abilities, but also from the fact that he can project your Contagion auras over an enormous swath of the battlefield from turn 1. He does not have to wait until later in the game or use psychic powers or stratagems to project that aura. He just does it immediately, and you just get to make use of those. This is very important because he is probably going to be a relatively aggressive model. He's really incentivized to move up the table quickly with that high movement value and that high resilience. And that means he's going to be projecting that big 9-inch Contagion aura into the front lines of your opponent's models from an early turn, which means that offensively oriented Contagion abilities are going to be really good. -1 toughness on most of your opponent's army is a big deal. And there are several Contagion effects that buff your ranged attacks. And that means that Mortarion can act as sort of a ranged attack support piece. Whether or not that's the most efficient way to run him, I don't know, but I think it is certainly very cool. So, now that we're talking about Contagions, let's talk about some of the synergies you can use alongside Mortarion, starting with Death Guard Codex Synergies. Obviously, there are a bunch of psychic powers that are awesome on this guy. Miasma of Pestilence, I think, is the number 1 big one. That gives him -1 to be hit, so further compounds his ridiculous defensive profile. He also has Gift of Contagion to potentially reduce the strength of enemy units that he targets, which means that if you have something coming in with like a big Thunderhammer that is strength 8 and could potentially be wounding him on 4s, you can drop that strength back down and make it wound him on 5s. And Gift of Plagues puts him to a 12-inch Contagion aura, so he's even better applying those debuffs to your opponent's army. There also are a couple strats to do mortal wounds with this guy. Unfortunately, Diseased Effluence does not work on him because he is demon keyworded, but I think it actually would be awesome because he is going to be stuck in combat for so long, potentially dealing a bunch of additional mortal wounds to your opponent's army is really good. Probably makes sense that it doesn't work on him, though. However, you can use Befouled Incubators to blow people up for additional mortal wounds if he's fighting into a big horde unit, for example. And when he dies, you can use Eruption of Filth to automatically explode him. Although do keep in mind that the Eruption of Filth explosion is significantly less large and powerful than his regular Putrid Explosion ability. Now, before we talk about the Plague Coast synergies, let's talk about some of the other Chaos Subfaction synergies that you can use along with him. One of the biggest strengths of the Chaos Superfaction is that you can mix and match all of the different subfactions together really well, and they all work together great. And so I think it's worth talking about some of the other codexes when we're covering this Mortarion datasheet. First off, like we mentioned before, he has the Heretic Astartes keyword, so he does work with Chaos Space Marine psychic powers. The most important ones being Warp Time for a double move. That's a big deal. Allowing him to move 24 inches before he charges is huge. Prescience for +1 to hit. Not really relevant for him because he does hit on a 2+ already, but if he is running into any hit modifiers, it will be nice for him. And last but not least, the Diabolic Strength to increase his strength to 10 and give him an additional attack. I don't know why you would need to be strength 18, but you know, maybe Brayarth Ashmantle's there and you really want to put it to that guy. Now, one thing I was really worried about in the Death Guard Codex was the potential for like really easy healing abilities. Like a 1 CP heal for D3 at the command phase or something like that would be kind of gross on Mortarion since it's so difficult to sink wounds into him. Fortunately, as far as I can see, there's no way to heal Mortarion in the Death Guard Codex, but that is certainly not the case for the Chaos Demons Codex. Well, unfortunately, you can't use the stratagem to heal him because he isn't Chaos Demon faction keyworded. He is a Nurgle Demon, so you can heal him from Fleshy Abundance. You can also give him bonuses to wound from Virulent Blessing if you really need to, and you can make it even easier for him to hit units with his big scythe by reducing their toughness with Shriveling Pox. Now, last but not least, moving over to the plague companies, let's talk about what I think the best synergies are with him and the best picks are for his Host of Plagues ability. There are a bunch of different Plague Company Warlord traits that buff your ranged attacks or theoretically buff your attacks while your opponent is in the Contagion range, but I think for the most part, they're going to be affecting your ranged attacks. Ferric Blight improves your AP value, which is pretty good, especially if you're shooting at somebody with like regular bolt guns. And as we said before, for 1 CP, you can make those bolt guns into plague weapons, and if you are within 12 inches of your opponent, you can then full reroll to wound using Arch Contaminator. You can also combo that with the Tallyman Relic for exploding 6s to hit, and full rerolls for Mortarion's ability, and use Eternal Hatred for +1 to wound. So you could potentially be shooting like 40 bolt gun shots at AP 1, +1 to wound, -1 or 2 toughness on the target unit. You just crush people with bolt guns. Nurgle's Fruit also does something similar in removing cover, although that does require you to be in... Nurgle's Fruit does something similar in that it removes cover from your attacks, but, I mean, obviously that's, like, strictly worse, so not really sure you would really want to take that one. And last but certainly not least, Eater Plague gives you a Gene Rot Might style ability, so unmodified rolls of hit rolls of 6 automatically wound, which means you're getting less use out of your Arch Contaminator, but it does affect a wider variety of attacks, not just plague weapons. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that all of these Plague Host specific Warlord traits, for the most part, only affect attacks made by models from the same Plague Host. So if you are trying to use Mortarion to project offensive debuffs onto your opponent's army, you are basically going to be locked into one Plague Host while you're doing that. One thing that Mortarion does is replace the bracketed Plague Host keyword with the Death Guard keyword, meaning, for example, his Arch Contaminator ability affects all of your subfactions, not just whatever subfaction your Warlord belongs to. However, because the Plague Host keywords in the Plague Host specific Warlord traits are not bracket keyworded, he does not replace those ones, which means he is still limited to only affecting models in those specific Plague Hosts. Now, hilariously, that also means that Mortarion doesn't affect himself with any of these, which is funny, but it also means that it may be more optimal to pick the more defensively oriented Plague Host Warlord traits because those typically aren't keyworded. Certainly, the most impactful defensively oriented Contagion aura is Gloaming Bloat, which stops your opponent from re-rolling their hit or wound rolls while they're within this aura. Now, honestly, this seems too powerful, but we'll see how it ends up. I think definitely projected from anyone who's not Mortarion, it's probably fine, but given that Mortarion can sink himself directly into the center of your opponent's army and cover like 22 inches of the table with his aura, including his base size, means that it is almost impossible to get out of range of the aura and still affect him. You can also use the psychic power to increase the range of the aura to 12 inches, so like it's going to get you. That makes it even more difficult to get through his insane defensive stat line. A lot of subfactions in the game and random little abilities let you reroll your ones to hit or wound. Things like Rites of War, things like the High Fleet Kronos ability, things like Junither or Ouida's aura, and none of those will affect anything within 9 or 12 inches of Mortarion. So if he jumps directly into your army, anything relying on rerolls, especially to get through that Miasma of Pestilence, is going to do very little damage to him. That also means that he's sort of protecting the rest of his army, since you cannot then stay inside the aura and shoot other stuff and reroll. Super difficult to take this guy out. An army based around this Gloaming Bloat Contagion is going to be incredibly difficult to deal with. The droning is also another one that a lot of people are talking about. It halves your movement at the start of the movement phase if you are in range of the aura. This being a 9-inch aura from Mortarion, again, is going to be super duper powerful. Given that, potentially, he can, be double moved directly into the center of your opponent's army. If you do that early enough, they're going to have almost no ability to move onto objectives, or, I think even more hilariously, actually escape from Mortarion. If you base a move 6 unit with Mortarion, they cannot fall back out of his heroic intervention range next turn. They only move 3 inches, and you are going to be within 3 inches of them. So you just heroically intervene and kill the unit next turn. He basically traps your army in melee forever. So honestly, while I like the ranged attack combos from him, there are certainly some incredibly powerful combinations of these Contagion abilities and some relics and stratagems that you can use. It may just be that you use one of these more offensively oriented. It may just be that you use one of these more defensively oriented ones and use him as a body to project it into your opponent's army. But keep in mind that if you run directly into the center of your opponent's army, they're going to try to kill you. So the next question that we come to is, how hard is that? And will your opponent's army actually be able to kill Mortarion? So let's find out. Now, to do this math, I've assumed that Mortarion has all of his defensive stuff going. He's tough to say, 18 wounds, 3 plus save, 4 plus invulnerable save, 5 plus damage to gore, reduces damage by 1, and is -1 to be hit. In some situations where I thought that you wouldn't be able to get outside of the 9 or 12-inch aura, he denies you rerolling for the gloaming blow, and in some situations as well, if you are within 3 inches of him, so specifically if you're trying to get into melee, he's going to ignore your auras also, thanks to his Warlord trait. So let's start small. Let's talk about a regular old bolt gun, probably being held by a Space Marine. Now, I also assume that most of these are sort of in optimal range and turn, so a bolt gun profile, strength 4, normally AP 0, but we're going to call it AP 1, probably for tactical doctrine, or maybe it's a bolt rifle or something like that. And we're going to assume +1 to hit and wounds, because with Space Marines and your Salamanders, and you have Crucible Battle, or your Recitation of Focus, and Catechism of Fire, those are probably going to be active. And you're rerolling 1s to hit and wound for a Captain and a Lieutenant. Now, each of those individual bolt shots is going to deal 1.01 damage, approximately 1/10 of 1 wound to Mortarion. You need 178 bolt gun shots to kill him. Now, these can be from a unit of Intercessors, or Terminators, or even just Tactical Marines. If it is Intercessors, you can dump 60 of those out of a unit every turn, which means that in 3-ish turns, you should maybe kill Mortarion if you are putting all of your buffs on this unit of Intercessors and double tapping them every single turn and none of them die. Pretty difficult to kill that guy with these little bolt guns. So let's talk about something a little bit heavier. How about the big meta boogeyman right now, Harlequins? How many Fusion Pistol Harlequins are we going to need to kill Mortarion? Now, interestingly, Fusion Pistol Harlequins don't really need rerolls. So, shooting our little ballistic skill 3, strength 8, -4, D6, rolling 2, picking the highest weapon into Mortarion. What do we get? Just about a half a damage each. 0.417 damage each, especially being hurt by that -1 to hit with no rerolls or buffs to hit. Approximately 44 Harlequins to kill Mortarion. 44 Harlequin troops have to get within 3 inches to get that extra dice on and pick the highest on their fusion pistols to even try to kill this guy. 4 plus invulnerable save and toughness 8, really helping against those Melta profiles, which are everywhere in the metagame right now. Now, speaking of Meltas, let's talk about some basically regular old multi-Meltas. Nothing special going on. So, for example, you got a unit of multi-Melta Devastators. They came in their drop pod, and they're ready to shoot. Each guy shooting 2 shots at a net of D6 +1 damage. You're going to be +2 for the Melta roll, -1 for Disgustingly Resilient. And each one of those Devastators dealing 3/4 of 1 wound. That means that a full unit of 4 Devastators with an Armorium Cherub is only going to deal 3.75 damage on average, and you'll need 24 Devastator multi-Melta shots to kill him, or the equivalent of 5 units of Devastators all burning their Armorium Cherubs. That's a lot, and it gets even worse when you pack an even heavier weapon on those Devastators. Let's talk about las cannons. Given that he's toughness 8, las cannon strength 9 equivalent weapon is going to be really good to get through this guy, or so you would think. However, the low shot volume from these las cannons is going to hurt a lot. So, assuming a ballistic skill 4 las cannon, for example, from a las cannon Devastator, dealing only 2.78 damage per, so significantly worse than those multi-Meltas, who have double the shots and extra damage. That means that, on average, it takes 65 las cannon shots to kill Mortarion if you're not rerolling anything. That gets even worse if your ballistic skill is lower, so if you have a bunch of las cannons on, I don't know, like an Imperial Guard tank or something, it's going to take even more of them to kill that guy. Now, that said, there are some armies in the game whose reason to be is killing hard targets, and I think the number one of those is potentially the best faction in the game right now, Adeptus Sororitas, who have a lot of options to kill big stuff. And the scariest unit, I think, in the Adeptus Sororitas stable is Sisters Repentia. Now, unfortunately, Mortarion has, I think, maybe the perfect stat line to deny Sisters Repentia doing any damage. They're only 2 damage each, so he's going to reduce that to 1. He turns off all of their aura abilities, so they aren't going to be able to be affected by Tale of the Warrior or a Missionary. So even Bloody Rose Repentia are going to be capped at 3 attacks apiece, and if you take the Gloaming Bloat, they cannot reroll their hit rolls, which sucks. This means that each Sisters Repentia, including Exploding Sixes and the Bloody Rose strat for +1 to wound, deals a little under 1/2 of 1 damage per. 0.3978 damage per Repentia, which means it takes 46 Repentia charging Mortarion to kill him. 46! You can't even take that many. You can only take 27. Maybe you're double fighting with one of them, but there's no way he doesn't just immediately kill the unit in response. So, unfortunately, maybe the time of the Sister Repentia is over. However, I think we might have a winner here for the most efficient unit attacking into Mortarion. And, to be honest, probably one of the units with the most efficient damage of the entire game. That is Retributor Squads. Now, without taking into account Miracle Dice, a single Retributor, using both Storm of Retribution and Junith Eruita's reroll ones to hit and wound aura, deals 1.248 damage on average with her Multi-Melta to Mortarion. Now, this gets a little bit awkward because if you have the Triumph of St. Catherine in your list as well, you can drop 2 6s from your Miracle Pool on your damage rolls. So essentially, one of your Retributors is firing a flat 6 damage weapon. A little bit better than that since you are ensured that that weapon's going to convert. Now, including the effect of those Miracle Dice, this means that it takes approximately 14 Retributor shots to down Mortarion, which is certainly the most efficient unit that we've looked at so far. This is just over 2 Retributor activations to kill him, given that each unit can burn 2 Armorium Cherubs, and means that Sisters of Battle actually probably are just fine at killing this guy. They also have Abhor the Witch in their stable, so they can get full rerolls to hit and wound against him. Like, I'm pretty sure Mortarion is still just dead against most Sisters lists. They're just going to have to switch out from Repentia to Retributors, which a lot of Sisters lists are already doing, so Adeptus Sororitas, probably very little to fear from Mortarion on the table. Going back to our Space Marine friends, however, what if we punch him with his own scythe? What if we punch him with the Redemptor Fist, which is about the same profile as Silence, and it does only come to strength 14 instead of 16, so it wounds him on 3s instead of 2s. However, that big D3 plus 3 damage is going to be good, right? Unfortunately, a lot of that damage gets soaked up by the hit roll and the invulnerable save, both of which are 4 pluses. And means that you're going to need about 8 Redemptors to charge Mortarion to kill him. They also can't be affected by Warden of the Ancients if they are in melee with him, because they're not going to be affected by any aura abilities, so you don't even get the extra attack from that either. Now, as a Tyranid player, I'm also interested in how I actually kill this guy. It seems very difficult for Tyranids, given that almost all of our shooting is damage D3 or 2 damage, so probably not going to kill him with guns. I guess we're just going to smite him with Zone Throws, maybe? I don't know, who knows. But our primary damage-dealing unit in the Tyranid faction is the vaunted Hive Guard. So how does a Hive Guard do against his defensive profile? Now, unfortunately, Strength 8 going into Toughness 8 always sucks, and -1 to hit is terrible. So you aren't even triggering Symbio Storm off these guys. And as a result, they deal an average of 0.259 damage for each Hive Guard. That's not per shot. That's per the 2 shots from the Hive Guard model, which means that each unit of Hive Guard is going to deal on average 1.56 damage, meaning you need the equivalent of 70 Hive Guard to down Mortarion. Now, with a double Hive Guard unit, you can shoot the equivalent of 18 Hive Guard, which means that you're probably going to need the entire game to kill Mortarion with Hive Guard. Look elsewhere, Tyranid players. Now, for ages and ages, especially in 8th edition, the Castellan Knight was the benchmark for damage output in Warhammer 40k. So how does the Castellan Knight math up against Mortarion? Now, this is a little bit awkward. I had to fudge a little bit of math here because there's so many odd rerolls involved. But I think what I have is pretty close to being correct. As far as I know, the most optimal build for the Castellan Knight is House Raven, using the House Raven stratagem to reroll all of your ones in the shooting phase, including wounds, attack, number of shots, using the buffed attack volume from the Warlord trait, so you roll additional dice to determine attacks and pick the highest, and the Call's Wrath Relic Plasma Cannon. I also math this out with House Crast and the Headsman's Mark, which gives you +1 damage to get around the Disgustingly Resilient, but unfortunately without the reroll ones, it doesn't do quite as much damage. Now, with all that in mind, I also assumed that we are firing all of our weapons, but not at the optimal range, because as soon as you get within 9 inches of Mortarion, you are not able to use the Raven strat to reroll your ones to hit or wound anymore, so that's a little awkward. But because you are Raven and you're already -1 to hit, you can advance to get your Meltaguns in range, so we also added the Meltaguns in there, and we got an average of, ready? 10.285 damage from the entirety of a fully buffed Castellan Knight. Just over half kills Mortarion. You need 2 full activations of the Castellan Knight, putting all your CP into the 3 CP stratagem for your rerolls to kill him. Incredible. What a tank this jerk is. So far, basically no single unit in the game has been able to down Mortarion. Let's bring out the big guns. When you're dealing with Demon Primarchs, perhaps the best weapon that the Warhammer 40k universe has to offer is the ability to fight fire with fire. What happens if we pit brother against brother and fight Mortarion with Magnus the Red himself? Now, Magnus is a little bit special because he splits his damage multiple different ways. He's not just hitting you in melee, and his melee profile is significant. However, it is going to be pretty hard hit by Mortarion's defensive abilities. Just going in raw, Magnus deals just about 3 damage through Mortarion's defensive stat line with his staff. That said, most of Magnus's damage output comes out in the psychic phase. He's able to cast potentially 4 powers using Great Sorcerer. And as far as I can see, the most efficient damage-dealing powers that Magnus can bring to bear are his Smite, dealing an average of 4.42 mortal wounds with his Gaze of Magnus ability. On average, he deals 1 additional mortal wound with Infernal Gateway, another 1.5 or so with Infernal Gaze, and 1.4 with Tzeentch's Firestorm. That gives him a grand total of 8.38 mortal wounds, which is then reduced to 5.61 after Mortarion's damage ignore. If you include that with his melee profile, he's only dealing about 8 damage to Mortarion. Now that said, that's not the most efficient way that Magnus can approach this combat, and for someone as smart as Magnus, he'd probably switch it up a little bit. Now let's assume that instead of Infernal Gateway, which deals the least average mortal wounds because it is so difficult to cast, we instead successfully cast Death Hex through Mortarion's Deny. That means that our melee attacks are going to be doing significantly more damage. It means that we lose 1 mortal wound off of our psychic phase, so only going to be averaging about 4.9 mortal wounds after Mortarion's damage ignore roll. However, we double our damage output in the fight phase, dealing almost 6 damage, putting our total to close to 11 damage. That said, Magnus, just like Mortarion, can be a concentrated focal point for a ridiculous number of buffs. So what happens if we go absolutely ham with Magnus? And we assume that in addition to his 3 offensive powers and a successful Death Hex, we have also Diabolic Strength him, cast Prescience on him to get around the Miasma of Pestilence, and gotten an additional attack out of Boon of Change. That means that versus an invuln-saveless Mortarion, we are dealing 9.26 damage in melee. Adding that to the mortal wounds of the psychic phase, we are dealing 14.16 damage in total, meaning that a fully teched out Magnus the Red with an entire army's worth of Thousand Suns buffs behind him, and assuming that Mortarion rolls absolutely no denies in the psychic phase with his potential 3 denies, doesn't quite kill him. He's still alive on 4 wounds. It does put him to bottom bracket, but he is then ready to lay waste to Magnus in response, or at least try real hard to do a bunch of damage. We'll see if he gets through the Glamour and the Weaver, assuming those are up, if you have any additional psychic casts left after that turn, but oh boy. At least when he's compared to individual enemy units, Mortarion, I think, may be the single most difficult model to kill in the game. I think as befits the Primarch of the Death Guard, a faction that is known for its incredible resilience, should probably be resilient, you know? So that brings us to our final verdict. Should you put Mortarion in a Death Guard army? And that's, I mean, let's be real. They say there are no stupid questions, but that's one of them. Of course you should put Mortarion in a Death Guard army. This guy's incredible. Not only is he an incredible force multiplier for your army, giving you an aura of rerolls, targeted rerolls, and dropping contagions all around the table that makes it more difficult for your opponent to engage successfully into you, or allows you to deal more damage back to your opponent. He also hits like an absolute Mack truck, is very fast, especially in a faction which is mostly composed of speed 5 models, and on top of that is almost literally impossible to kill. It really remains to be seen what impact Death Guard is going to have on the competitive Warhammer 40k metagame, but I have a feeling it's going to be pretty warping. The factions that can deal with units like Mortarion are going to do pretty well, and of those, I think Adeptus Sororitas is the number 1. Potentially, some factions that can put out an immense number of mortal wounds are going to be able to compete as well. If you're relying on like an autocannon profile to deal a bunch of your damage, I don't see any way that you have to kill Mortarion. This guy is crazy and insane, and I can only hope that he is not too warping on the face of Warhammer 40k. But that said, I think we'll just have to see. A lot of people freaked out about Eradicators for a while, and while they were very good, and clearly one of the most pushed profiles that we've seen so far, at least in 9th edition 40k, they didn't end up being the most impactful thing. Obviously, they swung the meta a little bit, but Space Marine lists are just doing okay. They're not killing everything with Eradicators. And I sort of have a sneaking suspicion that Mortarion's going to be somewhere in the same line. He is incredibly impactful on the table, but he is also only a single model, and he's supporting the rest of a faction that's relatively slow and inflexible. So if you are playing a split scenario and Mortarion can't carry the game himself, or the Death Guard player simply can't compete on primary with a canny player who has a fast army. I am interested to see what effects this Death Guard Codex has on the metagame of 40k, and I think it's going to be a real interesting couple of weeks until we finally figure out exactly where it sits in the overall game. So anyway, that's this datasheet deep dive on one of these datasheets from this new Death Guard Codex, Mortarion. He seems like a pretty cool guy. If you have any synergies or thoughts on how you're going to try to kill Mortarion on the tabletop, go ahead and throw them down in the comments. And as always, I really appreciate you watching this video all the way through the end. You're the best. You're great. But you know who you're not as great as? My patrons that you can join over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. You get early access to videos. You get some extra free content. We just had an outtakes from the recent 40k faction tier list that Valdor and I recorded, where we said some very mean things about some factions that I ended up cutting out. That's on there. There's some other funny videos on there that are for patrons only. So highly appreciate it if you decide to go over and check those out and join the patrons. Thanks again for watching all the way to the end of the video. And remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.